Okay, we're doing the Red Atlantic, American Indigenes and the Making of the Modern World, 1000 to 1927. That's the years in which the research is. Now, this is Jance Weaver. Number one, let's talk about 1000 AD to 1927. These numbers were completely arbitrary. I thought it was odd, but when we discussed this in class, the numbers seemed to be arbitrary. It just seemed to just make a point that he wanted to. This person is half Indian apparently. And he wanted to make a point that the Red Atlantic, obviously the Red Atlantic is a play on Gilroy's Black Atlantic. And this is overtly stated in the opening where he compares his research to the Black Atlantic. I think his biggest point in specifically putting the year 1000 AD is to show that it's before that he feels Native Americans had an Atlantic presence before Christopher Columbus. I think that's the main part. A lot of problems with this book. A lot of problems. Apparently, this gentleman visited the university, and some people left with more questions than they came with. Questions just seem to not completely answer. His answers didn't seem to address a lot of the questions that they had. One thing that came up in class, I cannot take credit for this, is that this is a book allegedly representing Native Americans and their being excluded from Atlantic history, which probably nobody agrees with that more than me. The issue is all of Weaver's foundational starting and stopping points deal with Europeans. It begins with the Vikings. In the middle of the Vikings is Christopher Columbus. I mean, in the middle, 400 years later, he does 4 pages on Christopher Columbus. Like, who needs a lot of information about Christopher Columbus? Everybody knows about Christopher Columbus. And then it ends with you all know who it is. The person whose baby got stolen did the Atlantic flight. Lindbergh. What's the man's name? Lindbergh. Atlantic flight. Yeah, Charles Lindbergh's 1927 Atlantic flight. And for whatever reason, he felt that ended. He used that occasion to mark the Red Atlantic. Don't know why. And there were some things in this book as to where he referred to the Red Atlantic after 1927. That wasn't the most troubling part of the book. The most troubling part of the book was this. At the beginning of the book, in the introduction or preface, I can't remember which one, but it's before the book starts. He states, in reference to the Black Atlantic, that the Red Atlantic was as important as the Black Atlantic and was just as central, if not more, than the Black Atlantic. And we debated this topic but there was so many ways to align with Gilroy's work as opposed to being in opposition to it. I found I found it really, really strange that this author felt more bothered by the fact that a person wrote a book saying blacks were central to the transatlantic history instead of whites excluding Native Americans altogether. Because the two would have a common theme against being equally excluded. If both felt they were central, the most common or the most reasonable or expected perception would have been as central as the African was the native. Both have been left out, which really would have added to the historiography if he'd have said it that way. But it clearly was like, I don't want to mess with white people. I'm going to mess with black folks. And that's not Darnell being Brother Black a lot. This is literally what it said. It did not focus on the exclusion for hundreds of years of Native Americans in transatlantic history, Atlantic history, and history period. It specifically focused on the fact that in, what year was that? In, I don't have Black Atlantic's year in front of me, but when the Black Atlantic was written, that just drove him crazy. And the Black Atlantic was probably 2012, 2010, 2011. So it was like the fact that for almost over 1,000 years, Native Americans were written out of history, that didn't bother him. But when this brother writes a book to say that black folks were central, that sent him over the edge. And he never touched that situation again. And some people in the class were saying, well, you know, maybe that was just an error in the book. And I don't think that I am so bright that it took me to notice that. So several people noticed that it was just put there and dropped. It was never picked back up. It wasn't at the end of the book. That would make a better conclusion than opening statement. An opening statement means I'm going to explain this. And there was no way to explain it, which is the rationale between why I can say it was not in the rest of the book, is because if you try to explain it, what's going to come out is the most reasonable argument that they were just as central and they were just as important, but one wasn't more important than the other one. So it completely got dropped. But it was important enough to be put in there, standalone in the beginning, where it seemed as though there was some hostility. I don't think it was competition, which that came up in debate. Maybe he's saying, no. Now, I do find something funny, because neither book did I truly appreciate. I didn't not appreciate him. I just didn't appreciate him. I think I'm quite defensive of my Native brothers and sisters with the time that I got to spend with so many reservations and natives in Nevada and Fallon, the Reno Sparks Indian Colony in particular. It did not seem, this book did not seem like it was written from a Native American's perspective. Now, I didn't care for the Black Atlantic either. I thought it was too hard to read, and the point that he was making could have been made a lot more simple. But at least that book did come from, like, you had a feeling it was a black dude that wrote it. Now, both of these people are mixed race, but it seemed like there was a black perspective in that. The Red Atlantic did not seem like it was a black perspective, and it didn't seem like it was written for Native Americans. It seemed like it was written for white people. But it wasn't anything drawing you into the Native experience. I've been drawn into the Native experience by Native Americans. That's why I know it when I see it, or I feel that I'm qualified to speak on it. So, a book to be read, lot of it didn't seem to sit on the rails. It went in a whole bunch of different directions. But definitely an area, if it's trying to bring the focus to my Native brothers and sisters, I'm with it.